Welcome to East by West Farms, where we grow what we eat and we eat what we grow. In this video, I will show you 10 native plants that we grow for food. This year has been extremely dry for us, and it's been very challenging for gardeners to grow anything. It started out with a very dry spring and then a hot and dry summer followed. The plants that were grown well are the native plants. At East by West Farms we practice permaculture. That means a lot of things. One of them is that we grow things where they want to grow. In this video, I'm going to show you 10 native plants that grow really well in this hot and dry environment in north central Texas. Squashes. We have a lot of squashes. Squashes includes melons and gourds. They are native to the United States and grow really well here. They produce a lot of food for us. We practically live on butternut squash through winter. We also have winter squash. Winter squash produces this huge fruit that are green and hairy and waxy outside and white inside. I think they're also called wax melons. They are very well adapted to the local environment. Squashes are annual, so we need to reseed them every year. Usually we grow them from seed that we collect. They provide a fantastic amount of ground cover. They have very deep, very thick roots, so they can get pretty deep into the soil. Squashes need direct sunlight. They don't grow in the shade. They have been cultivated for 10,000 of years in the Andes and have been propagated through Native Americans throughout the Americas. They came through the rest of the world after Columbus and are established pretty much everywhere in the world. Japanese squashes are very well known. Kabocha squash, you can buy them in the grocery store. In other parts of the world, you have squashes like these huge winter squashes, and they are eaten as soup or as a vegetable. Here we have our patch of sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are native to Mesoamerica, have been cultivated for thousands of years. Sweet potatoes are really not potatoes at all. They are in the morning glory family. They grow tubers that are edible, but the leaves are also edible and really tasty. We have another video on how to cook sweet potato leaves. Sweet potatoes are pretty much spread all over the world now. It started with the Spaniards in 1590s. They brought sweet potatoes to China. Then the Portuguese brought sweet potatoes to Japan in the early 1600s. In China, sweet potato tubers are really more of an emergency food. You eat sweet potato tubers when you don't have any rice anymore. The other use for sweet potato leaves is that you chop them up and feed them to pigs. Some reports from Zen monks that go up in the mountains, grow sweet potatoes and live on sweet potato leaves for a few years. 2 years ago, our whole garden was full of sweet potatoes. Last year, the deer figured out that they're really tasty and gobbled them all up, so we ended up with almost nothing. This year is a little bit better, but we do see some rabbit damage already. Sweet potatoes grow very well in dry areas. We hardly water them here. Once in a while I put some water on the sweet potatoes. So they're very hardy, very well adapted to our dry and hot climate. Tubers supposedly grow best at temperature of 24-25 degrees, which is, I think it's mid-80s, maybe lower 90s. But we like to eat the sweet potato leaves. To grow sweet potatoes is really easy. You just take some cuttings, stick them in the ground, and they start sprouting. So easy plant to grow. It's very nutritious, it's healthy, it tastes good. As long as we keep the deer and the rabbits out, it's usually a pretty good harvest. Right here we have a Chiltepin Texas that's also called the Texas peppers. It's a native plant that grows specifically here in Texas. The Chiltepin pepper is also the official native pepper of Texas since 1997. It's a very different type of pepper than the other peppers, specifically bell pepper, jalapenos, habaneros. Texas pepper has very small seeds. They look like little goji berries. They are extremely spicy. They make these small bushes. Our neighbor gave us some peppers 2 or 3 years ago. We just spread them in the yard and they more or less self-seeded last year. Most of the peppers are harvested already. I'm not sure if they will have another flush of flowers when it gets cooler. Usually during the summertime they are just in dormancy. After summer, when the nights become a little bit cooler, which is kind of starting right now, we will possibly see a few more flowers coming up. Yeah, I think I see some flowers here. And I might get a second harvest of peppers. I believe they are annual. Some of the peppers are perennial if it doesn't get too cold. The peppers don't like frost. They get mushy leaves as soon as they get some frost. So if we would be in a climate kind of like further down south, Houston or Austin or Galveston down on the coast, we might be able to get these peppers through winter. Down here we have another interesting plant. This is purslane. Purslane is the only plant that I'm going to show you in this video that is not native to the Americas. It's a plant that comes from North Africa, Middle East, India. Interestingly enough, there's been some research that showed that purslane was actually cultivated by Native Americans before Columbus arrived here. Purslane is a great plant. It's crawling. It's kind of like a succulent, I call it a cactus. It needs very little water. It has these fleshy stems that store water when it rains and can survive some severe droughts. It's very flavorful. It's great for soups and for cooking with eggs, for example. We have this grown here wild. It just showed up. There are a few patches. Right here's one. Over there's another one. Next to the purslane, I've got some spotted spurge, which kind of looks the same as purslane, but it's a totally different plant. It also has these fleshy stems, much smaller, has much smaller leaves, but the leaves look very similar. Spurge is poisonous, so you definitely don't want to mix it up. It's very easy to spot if you have two of them growing next to each other. If just one grows without the other, then that's really easy to mix up. This little shrub here, that is a Yaupon Holly. It's a native Texas plant. It's a small shrub. This plant, we got this from a place where they got rid of the landscape. It makes some beautiful bonsai. Scientific name is Ilex vomitoria. Vomitoria is vomiting. The story behind that is that when the Europeans came and categorized the plants, they observed Native Americans in their rituals vomiting and attributed that to a brew that they brewed from the leaves of the Yaupon Holly. We know now that this is not true. The Yaupon Holly is the only Texas native plant that has caffeine, so you can make a coffee type brew out of the leaves. You want to have a whole hedge of Ilex eventually, but that's going to take a while. It is very resistant, a very resilient plant. It can tolerate drought, it can tolerate sand, it can tolerate salt, so it can grow pretty close to the ocean. And it's just a wonderful little plant with small leaves, small growth, ideal for a local resource for coffee. Here we have another fun plant. That is a ground cherry. It's another Texas native plant. We did not plant this plant here. We didn't seed it. That plant just popped up by itself. We have a few more over there next to the house, a few more in the garden. It is a member of the nightshade family. Most of the nightshade plants are toxic, few exceptions like tomatoes, potatoes, ground cherry. It has these little lantana kind of shaped fruits. Inside these bags are fruits that are orangey yellowish when they are ripe, poisonous when they are not ripe. I have some ground cherries here on the ground. They fell off. The bag is brown. Well, actually this one doesn't look very ripe. It's still green. Let me check out the other one. Yeah, that's pretty green too. That's very green too. I'll keep them up on the windowsill for a while, see if they turn orangey, and then we're gonna eat them. Great plants to have in the garden. They are very easy to grow. Here they grew by themselves. They don't need a lot of water. They're annual plants, so they usually let some of them reseed themselves and see where they pop up the next year. Here are sunflowers. I've got a domesticated sunflower right here, and behind me there is a stalk with a bunch of native sunflowers. Sunflowers are native to the Americas. They've been domesticated for a long time. They've been exported pretty much all over the world. These sunflowers are absolutely amazing. They are the only plants that have been flowering throughout that drought spell. Their deep roots help to break up the soil and get nutrients up from deep in the soil to the surface. Usually we just chop and drop them after they are done. There's a big difference between the domesticated sunflowers and the native sunflowers. The domesticated sunflowers are bred to have one big head with big seeds. The native sunflowers have multiple heads, much smaller heads and very small seed kernels. The native sunflowers, they just popped up here. We didn't do anything. In this area here, every time you have some disturbed land, you have a construction site, move the soil and leave it for half a year or a year, you'll see sunflowers native sunflowers popping up everywhere. They are great for pollinators. They attract bees and other insects. We harvest some of the heads and feed them to the chickens. So it's a great plant to have in the homestead. Tomatoes. What would be an American garden without tomatoes? Tomatoes are the quintessential American fruit or vegetable, and everybody's grown tomatoes all over the world. Tomatoes have become probably the single one most cultivated plant of hobby gardeners in the world. Tomatoes are sort of a native plant, but the tomato that we have today is highly cultivated and really has not an awful lot to do with the original wild plant that later on became the tomatoes. My understanding is that the wild tomatoes are tiny. The history of tomatoes is actually very interesting. Aztec cultivated them thousands of years ago. The conquistadors brought them to Spain. Thomas Jefferson found these tomatoes in Paris and reintroduced them to the United States and cultivated them there. It took until the 1870s before the tomatoes really took off and become a staple in the American backyard garden. Growing tomatoes in Texas is actually pretty difficult because we have such a short growing season. Actually, we have two growing seasons, one in spring and one in fall. In summer, the tomato plants really don't do an awful lot. It's too hot, it's too dry for them. We exclusively grow cherry tomatoes. They ripe faster, and we usually get a very good harvest of cherry tomatoes. So tomatoes, a native plant that should be in every backyard gardener's garden. Pecan trees are the quintessential American trees. Pecan trees are native to the Americas and have been exported to anywhere else. Pecans are huge trees. They are very tall, wide stems when they are grown. They don't grow very fast. It takes quite a while before you see nuts. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington Both of them are known to have had pecan forest on their property. Now you can see here we're on the prairie and there are not an awful lot of trees growing. The soil is very heavy, it's very tough on the roots because when the soil dries out it gets these huge cracks. Not all trees can withstand that. We have a bunch more pecan trees that the squirrels brought us. We grow them in pots. Another native tree, a pecan tree that should not be missing on any homestead. So here we have an interesting plant that looks just like a blackberry, has very similar leaves, has very similar flowers, and has very similar fruits. The difference is that this plant does not have these upright canes that the blackberry has. That is a native plant, it's a dewberry. It grows wild here, it grows in the trees, it grows at the edge of the forest towards the prairie. The dewberry is edible, it has very sweet flowers. We haven't tried to eat them yet, but next year in spring, when we have dewberries, then we'll harvest them and eat them either just raw or make them into jelly. Dewberry, another native plant that's well adapted to the hot and dry climate that we have over here. Here's the essence of the American Southwest, the prickly pear cactus. We are up here in north central Texas, so we don't have an awful lot of prickly pears here, but once in a while they pop up. That one's interesting because it's growing under a tree. You know, the chickens usually roam around here. They have some beautiful, beautiful flowers in spring, and then they grow fruits out of the flowers. The fruit is edible. They're supposedly very tasty. Out here they are considered wheat by the farmers, so farmers don't really like them. I guess the cows step into the spikes and hurt their feet. Prickly pear cactus, another native plant that can provide food in an emergency situation. Those are some of the 10 native plants that we grow for food during the north central hot and dry summers. We love our native plants. We integrate them in our permaculture garden and they give us food for the whole summer and throughout the winter. Thank you so much for watching. If you like that content, please give us a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. If you want to follow our adventure in permaculture at the East by West farm, please hit the subscribe button and you get a notification every time we post a new video.